afternoon. Everyone's in the front row today. That's great to see you all there.
And I have my notepad and my pencil.
Good. You are all
taking
set.
notes.
There won't be a test
You
afterwards.
might write the
will there?
book, right?
I've got a multiple choice thing we can put up on the screen if people really want to.
Reading is all set.
Okay, all right,
That's
we're
great.
good. Yeah.
Welcome to the Dorset Historical Society Third Thursday Lunchtime Lecture for June 2022. I'm John, the curator here, and we've got a great thing for you today. Chris Smid of New England Slate will be talking about slate industry, history, and contemporary stuff. He has 4 quarries on 120 acres in Poultney, Vermont, and he is the
Slate
co-owner.
quarries?
Slate quarries, yes.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, that makes him an expert.
I didn't know it was a quarry, really. I'm sorry.
The co-owner of New England Slate with his father and Clay Heald. He worked in the quarries in high school and college, but became more full-time in it back in 2003. So he's closing up on 20 years. None of us want to contemplate. So, without further ado, let's welcome Chris.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful afternoon. I appreciate the chance to come down and visit for a little bit. I feel like a bit of an interloper bringing the slate industry down into marble country, but I appreciate the warm welcome. So, just a little bit north of here in Rutland County and a little bit across the border in New York, there's a great deposit of stone that has been utilized around the world for centuries and really exploited here starting in the mid-1800s. So we'll talk a little bit about the geology of slate, how it's formed, its geographic distribution around the world within the U.S., more specifically in Vermont, and then we'll talk about some of its uses, how it's extracted from the ground, fabricated into the different products, and then look at some of the differences between the U.S. slate industry and the European slate industry and kind of how the world of international business and the internet is changing the historic industry that is so prevalent here. So feel free to jump in at any point with questions. Just shout them out if something catches your eye and you want to talk about it a little more. So a little bit like marble, slate is a metamorphic stone formed from the ocean and lake bottom sediments deposited hundreds of millions of years ago, 300 to 500 million years depending on the formation. And those sediments get deposited, and then as continents move and collide, sediments get buried, the eons of pressure and temperature build up and actually change the alignment of the minerals in the stones from a sedimentary deposit where gravity filtered out the clays and sands at the bottom of the ocean and actually realigns and changes those mineral structures just slightly. And in the case of slate, it creates a cleavage plane, a little bit like a diamond. If you hit a block of slate in the right spot with a hammer and chisel, it will cleave off in a planar fashion, which yields the roofing slates that are so prevalent here in this part of the world. So that's what that geologic metamorphosis of ocean bottom sediments being squeezed over time with lots of temperature and pressure, and then stopping at the right time allows that cleavage plane. You can see a little bit in the graph in the upper left, some of the constituents and then the degree of metamorphism and how slate falls in between shale and then phyllite and schist and gneiss. So it's a gradient, like everything in nature. There's no on or off. It's a gray area, a spectrum. And the term slate, the geologic term slate, is actually quite broad and involves a wide variety of minerals and metamorphic states. What we'll be talking about today is the commercially usable deposits of slate. You have this broad spectrum of geologic slate, but what can you actually get out of the ground and make into a saleable product? And that is a much smaller subset of slate. This geologic formation that's exposed is actually up in Castleton between Glen Lake and Lake Bomazene, and it shows some of those kind of an early stage of metamorphism where the ocean bottom sediments start to get bent and curled with the time and pressure. So it's just a great example of a exposed. Very seldom do you get a cross section of the graph showing how those sediments and those layers get folded and bent by the. Yeah.
I just wanted to understand better the material.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts, so Genesis is the bottom, and that's what you were talking about with regard to.
Yeah,
the-
so,
I just wanted, people just
absolutely, sure.
break
So-
that down.
So I think they've kind of, it's a slightly overly simplified chart. So with clays, really fine sediments, that would be in the ocean bottoms. When the clays get compressed with more and more time and pressure and heat, the first step in that metamorphosis is into shale. More time, pressure, heat into slate. Continued time, pressure, heat, it goes into phyllite and then schist, mica schist, nice. So it's kind of a progression of time, pressure, heat, like baking something in the oven from a soft, moist cake to a really hard, dry cake, right? So
And
somewhere
is
along there.
shale moist? Is that how you?
Yeah, so it's less consolidated, you know, it flakes apart generally. It's a little softer and crumblier.
Okay.
And then slate is more solid and unified, and then it gets harder and harder as time and pressure go on.
Thank you.
And then I think the column next to it is sand, a different ingredient to start with, but a similar progression through the process.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So I talked a little bit about what makes slate unique is this cleavage plane that allows it to be split into thin pieces. And that's an example of a quarry worker taking a block of slate. I'll have a video of that process later, but that with a hammer and chisel in the right direction breaks off these 1/4 inch thick pieces that can be used for roofing or flooring. And that's the product that will eventually end up on the roof. So it's all done by hand. There's no magic saws or anything fancy. It's literally splitting based on the geologic properties, splitting that stone into those 1/4 inch thick pieces. So that's why it takes a very special combination of those pressure, temperature, time, mineral constituents to have that commercially viable slate. And certainly there's other types that you cannot get to look like that on a pallet. But roofing's not the only product slate's used for. Here's some examples of architectural pieces with slate: stair treads, wall panels, certainly hearths, countertops. It's a beautiful, beautiful stone. It takes a polish or a hone very well. It almost feels soft after it's been polished and honed. And being 100% natural, they're unique markings, just like marble. You know, there's lines and swirls going through it. It's absolutely beautiful in the right setting. More so in other countries, but to a certain degree here in the U.S., the aggregate, the types of slate that aren't commercially usable for roofing or for architectural products, get ground up and can be turned into road base or aggregates for concrete and construction. So roofing is kind of the biggest product that is of slate currently, and it has been through the centuries. And there are slate deposits scattered all around the world. Certainly we'll talk most today about the Vermont deposits. But there are mineral resources in Europe, China and South Asia, and a little bit in South America that have been developed to some have been developed well and have been commercially important. Others are just kind of anecdotal, but it is scattered throughout the world. Here's a picture of probably the granddaddy of all the slate quarries, the Penrhyn Quarry in northwest Wales. So kind of the modern slate industry in terms of extracting slate and using it for construction, the Welsh population is kind of the instigators, the inventors of that technology, and this quarry's been around for certainly hundreds and hundreds of years, and maybe even 1,000 years or more. And this whole landscape in northwest Wales is home to many, many quarries, and this is still operating today.
Did you swim there?
You probably could. They have recently put a zip line across the quarry
Oh, wow.
as a tourist attraction.
That would be so much fun.
Yeah.
What's a zip line?
So it's a cable suspended in the air.
Oh,
And for those with a strong constitution, you put it on a harness, you clip your rope to the cable, and they give you a big push. And you hope you make it all the way across without falling off or being stuck in the middle. So it's a little bit of a thrill ride. And I think at one point it's Europe's longest. You know, they tried to promote these things to draw tourism, but there was a big push for a while to diversify the economy in rural Wales, and that was one of the things they put up. So it's still there. If you make it over there, go see the Penrhyn Quarry, get a quarry tour, and see the zip line.
question, did Welsh immigrants come and work in the quarries?
Absolutely, yes.
In the slate, yeah.
Yep.
Oh my
And we'll talk a
God.
little more about that, but that was a driving force in the Mountain Slate industry for sure. The raw minerals were here, but no one really knew what to do with them until a Welsh immigrant saw the stone sticking out of the ground and said, "Hey, I recognize that." And we'll circle back to
Okay,
that.
sorry,
No,
sorry.
no, it's totally fine. So yeah, great historical resource here, and there are great slate museums, there's railroads. The slate industry played a tremendous role in the development of Wales economically, and there's a whole network of rail systems that were developed to get the stone from the quarries up to the ports. Castles, you can just imagine the infrastructure associated with the riches that the slate industry once provided. Here in the Northeast, the geology of the world deposited several types of slate in the northeastern part of the U.S. There were quarries in northern Maine, north central Maine, that made a really nice black slate that was super popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The vein of slate in Maine is vertical, so the slate gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And it became very expensive to extract, and they actually tunneled like you would with a coal mine or a gold mine. So around 1900 that was fine, but nowadays it's just too expensive to extract that slate, and I think in the 1950s that was the end of the extraction of the slate in Maine. A very good quality stone, widely regarded as some of the best ever produced in the world. It's on buildings all over the Northeast, and it's well over 100, 150 years old and still providing a great service life. We'll circle back to Vermont, so that'll be our focus, but there are deposits in Pennsylvania and Virginia. The Virginia quarries, there are two operating down there right now. Kind of a rugged, rough stone, but very, very long lasting. I think the Virginia quarry may have even predated some of the Vermont quarries, so I think they hold claim to the first slate quarry in the U.S. Pennsylvania slate quarries were, because of the proximity to the metropolitan areas of New York, had tremendous production, and for a period they were the dominant force in the slate industry. It's a black slate, a gray slate, but its mineral composition and its metamorphic properties didn't create the longevity that you find in the Maine or Vermont or Virginia slates. And most of not all, but most of the Pennsylvania slates had a service life of 50 to 75 years. So instead of going over 100 or 200, the Pennsylvania slates would start to get crumbly and white and flaky and start to delaminate and fall apart. So they were super popular for a while, went on a lot of roofs, and then once other alternatives became available, they were one of the first regions in the U.S. to kind of see a decline in their production. They still operate a little bit because of the historic base of installed roofs. There are a lot of old buildings that have Pennsylvania black, so there's still a call for it, but it's not as common as it used to be. So in Vermont, you can kind of see the red line circling the Slate Valley. So stretching from Fairhaven in the north down to Paulet Rupert in the south, there's a very narrow but long valley that holds the slate resources here in Vermont. And Vermont is unique for its colors. There are a wide variety, and I'm going to use the term Vermont a little bit loosely because there are quarries in New York within a mile and a half of the border.
We'll allow it.
Predominantly, today the quarries in New York make red slate. So the grays, greens, purples are all in Vermont, and just across the border in New York you'll find a couple of unfading red quarries.
Aren't they kind of blue?
Yeah.
The color's hard to see on this slide.
Yeah, colors are hard to see, and even in real life, different lighting conditions create different effects. Like shade versus sun, overcast. It's being a natural stone, it sometimes does defy categorization very well because it's a natural spectrum, and someone says I want a blue slate or I want a gray slate. Well, here's what it is. You decide how you want to name it. So that it can be a little tricky with dealing with architects in Chicago or LA or New York, and they're very specific about their terminology. And you're like, well, you can be as specific as you want, but the reality is I can't change the color of the stone, and this is this is what's available. We can't change the lot, the paint mix or the dyes or the colors. It is what it is.
Can I ask, what is the word, does that say unfolding?
Unfading. Yeah, great question.
Okay.
Great question. So in this roofing slate industry, there are two broad categories of slate: fading or weathering slates, and then non-fading or non-weathering. And that has to do with the mineral composition of the stone. You'll notice as you drive around on old roofs, You'll see some roofs that are all a gray-green color, very consistent across the whole roof. And you'll see others that have brown or tan or buff, orange, salmon type colored slates mixed in. And that has to do with the minerals in the stone reacting to the atmosphere once they get exposed on the roof. When they're in the ground and when it comes out fresh, it's all a gray-green color. But the mineral composition reacts, primarily iron-based elements, but other things can be mixed in there that will react to the atmosphere and oxidize, giving that reddish-brown tan color. So the slates that are known as unfading will maintain their color over time without much change, and the fading, weathering, semi-weathering names all denote slates that are going to show a little bit of that weathering brown tone over time. It takes 12 to 24 months to get an expression of those colors. So when you first put it up on the roof, it's all gray-green, and the homeowner's like, oh my gosh, I wanted the brown slates, where are they? Hold on, I'm not selling you snake oil, it's really gonna happen, be patient. And then over the next couple of years, this slowly emerges, and then, certainly at 50 years, you'll have a nice expression of it. But you have to be patient, and it takes a long time.
Wow.
So is it likely, it sounds like it's unlikely that you would get a mix, that you would pretty much get, like, if you were gonna, or. I don't know.
So there's really an unlimited opportunity to mix and match colors and sizes and thicknesses, and it's, so you can get a purple from this quarry and a gray from this one and a green from here, and it's the homeowner, the architect, the designer, the roofer can specify, I want 25% of this color and 15% of that, and make up whatever blend to suit a design parameter.
Unless you have some guy who puts in two pieces that are like black, which are, not like anything else.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking, was that when you
It's been
walked
done
by
at
a
our
roof,
house.
would you see different colors on one roof without the designer
Yeah.
being involved?
So it is possible that someone did some repairs at some point over time,
Right.
and they used whatever they had in their pickup truck or behind the barn.
So we'll call it
Yeah.
design.
Just-
Different type of
Yeah,
design. Right.
This design.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's unfortunate, but people sometimes aren't as concerned about the design or maintaining a historic look, and they're going for convenience, expediency, and will use whatever's available. So there is a market for used roofing slate, that when buildings come down or get re-roofed, there is a market for buying and selling reclaimed or salvaged slate, because some people want to have that 100-year-old look or that brown slate immediately. So when you do repairs, you can put in an old slate and it won't stand out and be as noticeable as a brand new one. But it's very complicated, right? I mean, there's a million different types of slate that have been produced all over time, and different weathering effects and staining from trees or staining from pollution. You can see here, this is in Australia. So that is an unfading green slate that's been on the roof in Australia. I think that was Sydney, but stained by pollution from the Industrial Revolution, from burning coal. Almost like you see it a lot in the U.S. around train stations, or even in the industrial parts of New York City and in New Jersey, that there's just a soot and a tar that gets deposited on the slate for hundreds of years. And in Australia, they actually take it off and clean it. Like, they will literally have a chemical solution, and they pay people to scrub the slates and put them back on the roof. Here in the U.S., they just leave them, or they tear it off and put on a new roof. But you can see a little bit of the picture's not great in the setting, but the dirty old roof here, and there's the new fresh one. So we've supplied some slate for this particular university to be re-roofed after 100 plus years in Australia. And
You supplied it?
we did.
Oh.
Yeah.
Does Australia not have slate?
They may have a little bit in Tasmania, but being a part of the British Empire, a lot of Welsh slate was exported to Australia in the 1800s. And apparently in the late 1800s, so someone in this room may be way more educated on the history of Australia than I am, so I'm going to tell you what I know, what I've been told, and feel free to correct me. But there was a period in the late 1800s where Australia had a gold rush of sorts and was extremely wealthy, and Melbourne was one of the richest cities in the world, and tremendous amount of construction, and the international trade. They would send whatever products Australia was making, perhaps the wool or sheep products, to the UK, and on the way back they'd put slate in the ballast of the sailing ships down low because it was so heavy, and it would be imported into Australia for all the construction in the kind of Victorian area, the 1800s, 1880s. So tremendous amount of Welsh slate went in there. there were strikes at the Welsh quarries right around the turn of the century. Some of the strikes went on for several years, and there was no Welsh slate produced. And in those periods, there was still building going on in Australia, still a lot of money, and they went to the US as an alternative. So the green slate from the US is a minority color. It's usually the purple slates that came out of the Penryn quarry in Wales, or the black slates from the other quarries in Wales. But you'll see these green roofs in Australia that came in during the period of the strikes that happened in around 1900, 1905 in Wales. So to answer your question, there's no developed source of slate in Australia. There may be some small deposits, and most of it came from the UK with an occasional historic job from the US during that period.
Ooh.
Yeah, another house I think that one's in Australia.
Really?
That one's out in the Pacific Northwest in Puget Sound area, some Black Slate in Canada. We're talking about shipping. This is a job we did in Peru.
Ooh.
And it was an American architect from New York City designing a compound, if you will, in Peru. And they ordered not only the slate from us, but they wanted us to put everything in the shipping container they would need for their roofing project. So we ended up supplying wood products and tools and copper and all kinds of things that we're not experts in, but they gave us a shopping list and they wanted it all packed in the container and sent to Peru. And then a handful of American roofers went down and trained a crew of local Peruvians to do the installation. And used Vermont slate on the buildings, and you can see us loading a container in our yard with all kinds of crazy stuff that we really had no idea. And doing the export documents was an educational experience for sure. It's a lot more than the usual 2 items of roofing slate. Kind of an interesting application. We talked about the creativity and the design element. This is a mix of different length slates. Usually around here you'll see all the same length, or maybe there would be longer ones at the bottom and shorter on the way up. But this is intentionally staggered to create a really unique aesthetic look.
That looks like an installation nightmare.
Yeah, it does.
You know, this one isn't as bad as it might seem. There are some that are definitely a nightmare. This one, when the slate is installed on a roofer will snap a chalk line horizontally on the roof. And in this particular job, we line up the tops of the slate with the chalk line. And there'll be different lengths. So you have to kind of mix up the lengths as you put them on, but as long as the tops all line up, then the bottoms will go up and down, and you'll maintain your waterproofing. Because that's the trick. You don't want to take the same size slates and scoop some down, because then they'll create a gap at the top and let the water in. So it certainly takes a little bit of thought. But
What are those little thingies on there?
so those are called snow guards, and those are designed to hold snow on the roof, so it doesn't avalanche onto a walkway or to shrubbery, gardens, landscaping. So yeah, they're meant to detain the snow on the roof.
That's the opposite of what I thought they would.
Yeah. A job in New Orleans, where going back to the international shipping history, the port cities, Boston, New York, Charleston, New Orleans, all had international trade, and before the U.S. slate industry had really taken off, the Welsh slate was imported into those cities, so there was a history of slate there, and to this day there's a fair amount of slate in New Orleans. One of the buildings on not the Gold Coast, the Newport, Rhode Island, the beach walk there that with all the famous, this is Salva Regina University, but there's a whole row of mansions all with slate right there.
Cottage Row or whatever they call it.
A church in the UK where they mix the Penryn purple, which you can't really tell it's purple in this shop, but there's the dark slate is the purple from the local quarries and the unfading green from Vermont. Brooklyn Post Office and Courthouse, a unique job that had sawn edge slate. Most of the time, slate has kind of a feathered or tapered edge, and I can show you that more closely later. But oops, wrong direction, sorry. Oh boy, hitting the wrong buttons. There we go. So this one is sawn edges. I'm not sure how it got specified with the 100+ years ago with the Pennsylvania black, but we replaced it recently with a modern equivalent that had sawn edges just like the original roof. That was very unique. Some jobs in Indianapolis with Vermont slates. So going back to the ebb and flow or the rise and fall of the industry, you can see at the far left, 1870, earliest earliest Vermont quarries were right around 1850. So it started to grow. By 1870, there was significant production in many quarries. But the industry really took off and grew largely because slate was fireproof. And in this era, the wood shakes were super common, but with trains and this is O'Leary's cow in Chicago knocking over the lantern and burning down the city. You know, there were all kinds of fires destroying urban areas because of the combustibility of the wooden roofs. So before metal roofing and before asphalt shingles, slate offered an alternative. It was long-lasting, it was attractive, and it would not burn. So from the 1870s through early 1900s, slate was just a gigantic industry in Vermont and Pennsylvania and some of the other places in the U.S., producing tremendous quantities of roofing slate. And in places like Pulteney and Fairhaven, there were thousands and thousands of people working in the slate industry, and there were communities that have disappeared. The West Castletons and the South Pulteneys and the Blissville areas, there are names on a map now, and they used to have hundreds, if not thousands, of people in these small communities arranged near quarries, and it's all just been erased. But during this period, there were trolley systems moving people around and railroads moving slate back and forth. Just a gigantic economic driver in this area. World War I, World War II, Great Depression, the advent of asphalt shingles all led to a steady decline in roofing slate. And now we're a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction in terms of production of what we once were in terms of an industry. So the mineral resource is still out there, but as an industry, it's, you know, the advent of different products has really taken its toll on the size of the industry.
And they're still cut by hand.
Yes, there's some exceptions, and I've got a couple of videos of that we'll talk about. So this is a photo taken on our quarry property. This is the Eagle Quarry from an unknown date, probably late 1800s. Photos courtesy of the Slate Valley Museum in Granville. But you can see some of the communities that pop up at the side of these quarries, right? And so we talked about the Welsh immigrants a little bit earlier. This quarry was first developed by Welsh immigrants, and they brought over a system of extraction that is unique to Wales and to one or two sites in the US. You'll notice these tunnel mouths here, these three dark holes. Those are actually tunnels that follow the vein of slate dipping down into the east, and they go underground, which is very unique in Vermont. Most of the time the Vermont quarries are open pit. They'll have a perimeter, and it's just straight down, and that's where the slate comes out of. But in this case, the Welsh miners that had done this in Wales came over here, recognized the deposit, and followed the good vein of slate down. And the reason they would do that is this is all overburden. And you can kind of picture the slant of the stone. We talked about the metamorphic properties and how the beds get folded. In this part of the country, the beds of slate are somewhere between 25 and 70 degrees of an angle, going up in the west and deeper in the east. So when they would find an outcrop of stone that was usable, good slate, they would follow it. And for a while it made sense to take the overburden off, to take this sliver off to get to the good slate. But pretty soon, as you followed the vein of good slate deeper and deeper, you had to remove more and more junk over top of it. And without diesel engines or hydraulics, it was a lot of work. So why not just follow the good vein of slate? We'll leave everything in place above it. And they would, cut the heart out of the watermelon, if you will, and follow the good, yummy piece right down the center and leave everything above it. So this quarry is filled with water currently. We were able to pump it down to a certain point, but the tunnels, according to historical records, mainly newspaper articles and some kind of anecdotal references, some people say it goes back hundreds of feet, maybe even 600 feet back underground. But we don't have a way to get the water out without investing a lot of money in pumps, but it'd be super fascinating for a scuba diver or a remote operated submersible to go in there and take some photos and see what we can find. So yeah, the Welsh came over, brought their technology, and this is almost identical to what the Welsh did. We had some mining engineers from Welsh Slate at the Penryn Quarry come visit and examine the quarry with us, and they were amazed at the exact, they felt like they were in Wales when they saw the marks on the walls and the size of the chisels and the holes they were doing and the way they worked the rigging to get the slate out. Very, very, very similar.
Were the Welsh trying to, or whatever, these immigrants, were they working with water coming in, or did that come they work?
Yeah, so not a tremendous amount. Some quarries are known as dry, some are wet. It just depends where the streams and water sources are and how quickly the quarries refill. Generally, you've got a hole in the ground, so at some point the water is going to come in, some faster than others. So they did have different pumping systems to get the water out and keep it dry and safe.
So it filled up with water when no one was watching
Yes.
the store?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. If you leave it alone for a few years, it'll fill right back up and look like a pond or a lake.
Yeah.
So a couple more points on this photo before we move on. Quarry sticks, you'll see a few of these left around the Slate Valley. So back, again, before hydraulics and diesel engines, everything was done by hoists. So you have a system of cables connected to these quarry sticks. You can see one coming up here, and there's some pulleys there and a basket. So they would use, that's how they would move the stone in and out. So they'd run these cables right down into the tunnels, put either rubbish or good stone onto them, and then have steam-powered engines to pull them back out. Everything was done by hoists. Some of the cables would go way overhead, and the carriage would come out, and then it would drop a chain or hooks down into the quarry, and the workers would wrap the chains around a big block of slate and hoist it way up in the air and take it over their heads out to the mill. So you'll see these piles of stone around the quarry sticks, because as the waste came out, it would get deposited. They'd pull it off to the side and drop it, and then send it back in for the good stuff. So you see these sticks with piles of debris around the bases. One on Saltus Road in Fairhaven, and I think a couple still in Paulette. They've mostly been knocked over and fallen down with time. But that was the technology. It was all cables and winches and poor guys watching their heads as someone would fly over the door.
So you know that it's waste if it's still there today?
Yes, yeah.
Because they would have sold it, okay.
Yeah, so we talked about the geologic term slate versus the commercially usable slate. And as a general rule of thumb, in a slate quarry in the US, in Wales, in Spain, only about 5% of what comes out of the ground is commercially usable. So 95% ends up in these rubbish heaps. It's inert, it's not chemicals, and there's no acid mine drainage, or there's no asbestos. It's just stone, just a clay ocean bottom sediment. So there's no pollution per se, other than the visual pollution of a pile of stone sitting on the hillside. But 95% is not usable.
You see one of those when you go out to Granville.
Yeah.
That's just rubble.
Yep, exactly.
And why is it rubble?
So there'd be some reason within each one of those pieces why it was not going to be cleavable with a hammer and chisel to make it into that 1/4 inch thick. So there'll be ribbons of inclusions of quartzite or other minerals that run through the stone that don't allow the splitting. Some of it just that didn't have that right recipe of minerals, temperature, pressure to make it just right, so you could get the 1/4 inch thick pieces.
So that's not a mine there, that's a waste pile.
Yeah, so we'd be very close to a mine. So the quarry or mine would be immediately adjacent to those piles, because it would be no more than 100 feet away. That's as far as they would string their cables. So they weren't transporting the waste very far. It'd be right next to it.
Right.
Right
Take a lot of
next to it.
energy to push it
Yeah.
further.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
And of course, everyone that visits, most people that visit the Slate Valley will look at these piles and say, what can you do with that? Like, you've got this great resource, how can we capitalize on it? And so many people have tried to find ways to utilize that. And unfortunately, it's so heavy and dense that, you can certainly crush it for road base or for railroads or for construction, but you can only afford to transport it so far before you run. It's just so expensive, you have to pay a truck or a train or something to haul it. And we just don't have enough population up here. By the time you get it to New York or to Philadelphia or to Boston, it's just too expensive.
Not to go backwards, I was watching earlier before I came down, and you talk about the density, how hard it gets the longer over time. Is bluestone related to slate?
I hear the word bluestone used a lot for landscaping stones, for walkways and such. I don't honestly know the geology of it.
The ice doesn't seem to get in it and crack it.
Right. So you're absolutely right. So finding a stone that doesn't allow the water absorption, because the water gets in and freezes and thaws and starts popping stone apart. So bluestone, I know, is very durable, like slate or like granite, where it holds up pretty well to the elements. So a couple other historic photos here. This is a slate mill. I believe it's on state land, right at the outflow of Glen Lake, where Glen Lake comes underneath a road and eventually drains into Lake Bomazine, so kind of the northwestern Castleton. huge building. It's hard to tell the scale in this photo. It was well over 100 feet long, and the water would come through this mill and power the machinery for making countertops and mantles and other slate products. So it's open to the public. It's kind of hard to find. There's a little trail marker in the bushes, but if you persevere and push through the wall of vegetation, it's a fascinating relic of the industry, and hundreds of people working there again, making all kinds of products, and now it's thousands of people go to Lake Bombazine State Park or go boating on Glen Lake. They're within 50 feet of that. I think this is 1868 in that headstone up there. They're within 50 feet of that as they drive by on the road and don't even know it's there.
Is there a rubble pile on the west side of Lake St. Catherine?
Yes, there's
Yeah,
Lake St. Catherine as a whole.
It looks like it.
Tremendous number of quarries along Lake St. Catherine. That's
And some of them are still active as
yes, absolutely. That was a very active area. That western Lake St. Catherine is still used today. So back in the early days, here's someone in Wales trimming slate. You see a fixed metal edge in front of him, holding a 1/4 inch thick piece of slate in one hand, and then using a rasp to cut the slate, chipping away at it. He would trace a line onto it to get the rectangular shape and size, and then cut it by hand. Some of the blocks being put onto a saw there. This is also a Welsh photo. More guys trimming. This is from the US, so now we've moved on to a mechanized trimmer. This would be a big flywheel here. You pump with a foot pedal, a little bit like an old-fashioned sewing machine. Get the flywheel going, and then a big blade rotates inside. We'll have a video in a second of that, but big blade swings around and cuts the slate, and just out in the elements.
Yeah, it looks cold, right?
Yeah,
Hill
yeah,
leaves
those-
on the trees.
Yep.
Ah.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, so in this era, I'm sure they're paid by piecework, right? You get these blocks, and these guys would make as much as they could in a day or week, and they'd sell their 50 pieces or 200 pieces to whoever the boss man was and get a few dollars, and it was all kind of informal labor like that.
Stand warm your hands, you're losing money.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure what the date is on this particular graph, but it shows, I'm gonna guess in the, I don't know, 40s or 50s in the US, but the big stones coming out of the quarry, pneumatic tools used to drill holes in the big blocks, and then wedges would be put in those holes to split the big blocks into smaller ones. And then you get the splitting, like we saw earlier, making them into the 1/4 inch pieces. Then that's a trimmer. You can see the foot pedal he's working on there. Instead of a rotating blade, that blade is like a guillotine. It just comes up and down. So with his foot pedal, that big heavy metal blade would chop up and down against the fixed edge. And heaven forbid your fingers and toes get in there, right? Pay attention. And then this gentleman here is using a punching machine. We still have a very, very, very similar punching machine in our shop. Looks just like that. But to be affixed to the roof, each piece of slate gets 2 nail holes. And again, just the geologic properties, if you take a pick or a point and hit the slate on the back, it puts a hole in it, and it kind of flakes out on the other side, making a little recessed cavity for the nail of the head, or the head of the nail to go down in. So that's kind of the final step. Once it's been split and trimmed and punched, then it's ready to go on a pallet and be shipped to the job site.
How difficult is it, like, can you mess up?
Yes.
And then it's just like that one's waste? Oh,
So the
painful.
punching's not that hard. The punching, usually if something breaks when you're punching it, it's because there's a defect in the slate and you hit something that causes the slate to crack. So it's not so much operator error at that point.
Okay.
Um,
With the other guys trimming and stuff?
Yeah. So we'll go through a modern production line next, and at each step in the production, someone's got to make decisions about how to utilize the stone. A little bit like a tree going into a sawmill. You've got this raw material, and how are you going to utilize it? What's your best way to cut it up to get the most value out of it? So that's really where the decisions or the mistakes get made about how to get the best value out of that big chunk. So this is the same quarry, the Eagle Quarry, those that we saw in the old photo from the 1800s. The tunnels are over here. So we've pumped the water out down to the bottom to get into the stone. The tunnels go deeper. But this, I wanted to illustrate kind of how the lay of the stone is, and how you can kind of visualize these veins of stone with some overburden here, a layer of green slate, some purple, and then it changes back to green here. And these are the bands of slate that get deeper and deeper going to the east, and that's what they were chasing underground in those tunnels. Luckily today we have excavators and haul trucks and hydraulics and diesel, and we don't have to run cables overhead. But
Where is this Eagle quarry?
it's in Poultney.
Oh, in Bolton.
Yeah, so the active quarries now are, the town of Wells and Poultney are probably the two biggest producers. West Paulet has a few down on the border of Wells. So West Paulet, Wells, Poultney, and a tiny bit in Castleton. So that stretch in there is really where it's all at. So here's a finger of that vein of stone exposed. We had just drilled and packed drill holes with explosives to separate these blocks of stone. And that's a different view of it. So you can see we drilled holes across here and found a natural joint in the stone and drilled holes there. And a little bit of explosives. You try not to use too much. You don't want to destroy the stone. You just want to separate it along natural joints. So then those would be the big blocks that get hauled up to the quarry to be put into the saws. So this gentleman is using a hand crank to pull a diamond tip saw through that block of stone. The saw blade is enclosed to keep the dust and noise contained.
So that box is a saw.
So inside there is a saw. I don't think I have a good view of it, but that, so now the saw head has been retracted, and you can see the cut through the block of stone there. So water's used to lubricate and to keep the blade cool, washes away the sediments or the fines that get created by the saws. And at this point, we're taking that big block and sawing it into something that's manageable to make the roofing. So we just brought it back outside so you can get a view of how it would be cut into strips.
How thick is that?
Probably about 6-7 inches. So once the blocks are sawn, you end up with pieces like this that are small, a little bit smaller than a microwave, but 6 or 7 inches thick. But think of a bread box or a microwave size, and that's what the splitters then take. And see if I can get my video to work here. You take this block that come out of the saw room.
That's something? Wow. It's like making sliced bread.
Yeah. So there are times when it goes to pop like that and it breaks, right? So if everything's going well, it all pops off in nice pieces. When it's not going well, you end up with a bunch of broken scrap.
That takes
Well, we're gonna look at your
experience,
roof
years of
differently, Mom.
experience.
So one piece at a time, still made by hand, very, very labor intensive, right? And that's one of our problems. At the end of the talk, we'll look at the future and trying to find employees nowadays who are willing to learn this trade. It's tough. It's tough. So they're the 1/4 inch thick pieces that have been split, right?
Wow.
So that's 100+ years on your roof.
But it's only like just a little ways.
Yeah, takes a long
And a
time.
whole roof.
Yes, it does.
All right.
So here's the trimming process. So it's now motorized instead of the foot pedal, but you get the idea that there's a big flywheel powered by an electric motor that spins this blade around.
Wow.
And you can see the feathered or tapered edge on these pieces that have been trimmed, which is different than a floor tile. Floor tile has the sawn square edges, whereas roofing slate has the feathered or tapered, and that's a product of the trimming. So floor tiles, because of the nice straight, clean grout lines, people like the sawn edge, but with roofing slate, it's all feathered or tapered edge.
Except for those people on.
Except for the Brooklyn post office, right? Those crazy, crazy folks. Yeah, good memory. I can tell you're gonna pass the test later.
How is that cutter maintained? Do they have to sharpen it, or?
Yeah, there's a blade, a metal blade that is attached to the flywheel, and that might get replaced every few years. It lasts quite a while.
A long time?
Yeah.
It's not like cutting it?
No, it's pretty
Do you do
durable.
special designs too, like rounds and things like that?
We do, yeah. So there's a special shaping machine that can make half round type shapes, beaver tails or fish scales or scallops, people call them. You can clip corners too to make hexagons and octagons. As you overlay the courses, you can get all kinds of crazy patterns, and you can start mixing in colors and have a red and a green and a black to make bands with different scallops and points and hexagons, and you can get really ornate with it. It's pretty cool. So this was the punching process. Again, let me hit play again one more time on this. The slate goes in, and that puncher, I think, it might be the same. I'm exaggerating, but it looks like the same darn puncher that was in that photo from a few slides ago. So technology,
Yeah.
technology hasn't changed much. All right. So that's kind of a look at the way the slate industry has been in the US for the last 150 years. You know, slate changes from cables to hydraulic machinery, but the idea of getting big blocks of stone out, sawing them up, pulling a chain or pulling a handle, drawing the saw through the stone, trimming it, splitting it, hasn't changed much in the US. We're going to switch to Spain for a moment. The country of Spain has a tremendous amount of slate. It's all black. They argue a little bit and say it's blue-black or blue-gray or gray-black, but in the US slate industry, it's black. So they're a competitor in the sense that they produce a similar product that has a long lifespan, and it is slate, but they don't have the color range that we have here. What they do have is scale. Their industry is gigantic. The European slate market is many, 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 many times bigger than the US. France, Belgium, Germany, the UK, big slate users, both historically and even in modern design, they still favor slate because of their, I think they just have a longer view on building maintenance. They build things to last for centuries, not for the 10 years you're gonna own the house in the US, and people don't wanna invest in an expensive roof. So in Europe, they have a longer time horizon, and are willing to make that investment, and the slate roofers there go to school for 4 or 5 years, and then apprentice for 4 or 5 years, and it's an art form, right? So the slate industry in Europe, many, many times larger, and Spain is the largest producer now. There were slate industries in Belgium, France, and Germany, mostly closed now with a few exceptions, and Spain is the largest producer. So what they might lack in range of colors, they have far surpassed the US in terms of investment in the industry and technology and modernization of the process. So their unit cost, they can produce slate way more efficiently than we can with people doing it by hand. So we've got a few videos and slides of kind of the modern era of slate production. It's starting to creep into the US because, as we talked about, fewer and fewer people want to work in the slate industry. I mean, face it, most kids would rather be on their cell phones playing a game than picking up a hammer and chisel.
Really? Do you're hiring?
Absolutely. I've got a puncher just waiting for you.
All right.
I tell my kids stay in school. My 14-year-old has been coming in. He's already just got off school last week, but he's already been in 2 days. He wants to earn money for a computer, so we got that puncher lined up for him. And as much money as you want to make, just keep punching.
$20 an hour.
Yeah, not quite yet. Don't let him.
Don't let her read the sign at the Dunkin' Donuts.
Right. So we got huge quarries in Spain. I'll speed this up a little bit, so we're getting close to 1 o'clock here. But basically, instead of blasting, they want to utilize every little bit of stone, and blasting can damage it. So they use wire saws. So they'll drill holes in the slate, fish a wire through it that has diamonds embedded in the wire, and pull that wire through the holes. So there's traction that's almost like a little bit of a train there. That thing is spinning and pulling tight on that chain, and over time, pulls that wire saw right through the stone, getting the stone out without the explosives. So we talked about the trimming and automating. We have a Spanish trimmer. There are blades inside there that are like saw blades. They call them a zip trimmer, and they spin around really fast, and the conveyor takes the slate past those blades. And notice there are no people.
Is it suction?
So yeah, there's a suction cup that picks up the slate, and then goes into the machine where it gets sawn.
Oh my God, this is so fast.
Yeah. I don't think. Yeah. So this.
The switch, right? That's
Yeah. There's someone there watching, wandering around the clipboard, making sure everything's working, but way faster. Even the splitter. I don't think I have a video on this presentation of the splitting, but they've automated the splitting process. Where those blocks, the microwave-sized blocks that we saw, they go into a machine, get turned up on end, and from the top and bottom at the same time, there are hydraulic or pneumatic chisels that pop it, and they go, and within seconds, that block 6-inch thick is turned into slate, individual pieces.
Yeah.
And then it gets tilted, then the machine, a robot squeezes it, turns it, stacks it, and it goes down the conveyor belt to the trimmer, where the suction cup takes it one at a time into the
Automatic punchers too?
Yes.
It's just acting like it's paper.
Yeah. So the trick here is that the Spanish deposits are very, very uniform, meaning that the block 1 is very similar to block 2, which is very similar to block 563, so that the machine can be set up to produce uniform slate from all that. Whereas in Vermont, there's so many impurities and changes and colors that you really need a human to do things a little differently. When he takes the hammer and chisel, oh, that doesn't sound quite right, I think I'm going to break it, I'm going to turn it over and tap on this other side, and turn it over again and tap on this other side to get the piece of slate. If you put that into one of these machines, it would hit it and explode in a million pieces, and it would get thrown out.
I wonder.
So, to this point, the Vermont slate has defied the production system of the Spaniards. Right? People have tried to bring over some of that machinery and automate it. It works to a certain degree, but not to the extent that they've been successful in Spain because of the just differences in the geology of the stone. These machines are extremely expensive.
Yes.
Extremely expensive. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to fully automate the process. Which leads to another difference in the industries. In Spain, their slate producers are like Ford Motor or, not quite Tesla, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Big companies, like multi-million dollar, multi-billion dollar conglomerates. In the US, the slate industries are usually mom and pop and a couple kids. And a 50-person operation is as big as you'll see in the US right now. And most of the operations are 2 to 7 people. So the investment, it's more like farming, and I'll draw this comparison later, but it's the small family farm versus commercial agriculture is kind of the difference we have here. And these are all small family plots of land that have been passed down through the generations, and Uncle Joe quarried, so I'm going to quarry, and my dad worked for him. And so you get these operations where it's kind of a family tradition, small, they're not saving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to modernize and buy, they're not buying new excavators, let alone buying new splitters, right? They're barely able to keep the old machinery they've had for 40 years running, and they're a little duct tape and some baling twine, and call the welder over and put it back together and keep it running. So that's kind of the mentality of the Vermont slate industry, the old Yankee frugality and hard work and just kind of tough it out, whereas the Spaniards are fully, embracing technology and innovation and investing huge amounts of money. So the U.S. slate industry is kind of at this inflection point with a lack of labor, lack of investment, small size, really starting to hamper our, the viability of the industry on a worldwide scale. We'll always be historically, there's so many buildings, so many buildings in the U.S. that have slate roofs. I don't think they'll ever go away, but we're not set up to be like a dominant force in the roofing industry. We're more kind of this niche, historic, artisan thing going on. So it's not really good or bad. Here's some more Spanish scale factories, right? I mean, just gigantic. Yeah, gigantic industry.
Oh my gosh, oh, look at that, wow.
Ready to go to market, and that would take hundreds of years of Vermont production. That's probably a week. And so we talked a little about the comparison to family farms. I think where we're at as an industry is trying to sell ourselves as the craft cheese, as the value added. We're making a specialty product. We're not a volume. We're not making something that's to be sold at Home Depot or sold by truckloads on the internet. This is something you come to the farm stand and get a gourmet heritage breed chicken for your whatever, right? It's a specialty thing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're at, unless someone comes and buys us up and invests millions and millions of dollars. There's all kinds of regulatory hurdles, the health and safety issues, environmental issues. Even though these quarries have been in the same place for 150 years, there are people, as more and more folks move to Vermont, they see these quarries, they don't want it, they don't like the diesel trucks or the hole in the ground or the pile of slate rubbish. Even though it's been relatively static for the last 150 years, it's still upsetting to some people, and there's increasing opposition to that traditional use of the land, and there's more and more pressure to regulate and shut down this type of industry and kind of leave the green fields and the woods and peaceful places to bike and hike. So there's got to be a balance there somewhere. I mean, it's tough. Act 250, I could talk for hours about the kind of regulatory environment of Act 250 and the regulations and how slate's treated there. But really the challenges are going to be labor going forward, trying to find the workforce to make the slate and compete in the world going forward. I don't know, talk for hours about any one of these topics, so if there's any questions, I know we're coming up on one here. I don't want to overstay my welcome in the Marble Valley, but.
What do you estimate the longevity of quarries?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really hard to tell what's left in the ground. There's still a tremendous amount of rock in the ground. How much is commercially viable is the real question. There are ways to take core samples that bring on a special drill that pulls out a long cylinder, and you can analyze what's in it. The tough part is you can do a small chemical analysis and geological, mineralogical evaluations, but you can't tell if it's going to be economically feasible to make roofing slate out of it. So you can tell what color it is, and is it a suitable density, is it have the right water absorption, is it going to split? But until you actually open it up and start trying to make these 18-inch by 12-inch rectangles out of it, it's really hard to tell if you're going to make money doing it. So there's stone in the ground for sure to go for another 100 years, but is it, given the market, can you charge enough in the marketplace for that product to justify the expense of getting it out of the ground? And no, I don't, throughout my knowledge, no one can really tell that, and it's just trial and error at this point. People, I'm going to give it a go and try it, or it's too risky for me, I'm going to go put my money in the stock market. Right?
Well, besides your company, are there other companies
Sure, yeah.
in the New York-Vermont border that
Absolutely.
are operational?
Yeah, we're a very, very, very small player. So Evergreen Slate, Camara Slate, Vermont Structural Slate, Greenstone, there's 6 or 8 pretty good sized companies. Newmont Slate is the one right on 149 outside of Granville. That's a pretty big operation. So there's about 10 to 15 players in the slate industry, probably 6 or 8 bigger ones, and then a bunch of small hangers on.
So you all work in the same veins?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Good job.
I have an odd question for you, just from something that you said that I probably misunderstood.
Yeah.
Sea green slate,
Mm-hmm.
can you get that from Wales, or is it just a Vermont?
Vermont.
Really? The reason I mention that is that William Butler Yeats, in one of his poems from the early 1900s, talks about building a new writing cabin or whatever that is incorporating sea green slate. So if that's when the time that the Welsh strikes were, he was getting it from the United States.
Could be. So there are some quarries in the eastern part of the UK, England, that may or may not actually be slate. Burlington stone, it's maybe more of a phyllite, and they've made kind of a greenish gray type generically you could call it slate. So I can't say with 100% determination that there's no gray-green slate ever made in the UK. There may be very, very small instances of very small amounts being made, but the predominant colors in Wales have been black and purple, and little else. Commercially, I don't think anything else. But so I don't know. Yeah, in sea green, so many people use that term in a very loose way, right? So is it like a stormy, dark gray ocean of the Irish Sea, or is it like a Mediterranean turquoise color? I don't know.
Right.
So in the U.S. slate industry, sea green refers to a weathering green slate. So a slate that's going to start off that gray-green color and get some of the pieces turn brown over time. How it was used in that particular literary example, I can only speculate.
Yeah, well, I used that.
Yeah.
Then when we were putting in a new mudroom in our house, to have that tiled with sea green slate, like in Yeats's poem.
Sure.
It would be interesting to know if he actually was getting it from this area.
That would be super.
So that would be super cool.
Yeah, it would be. It would be.
One other thing, just to, you knew Harry Stanton, didn't you?
Yes, not well, but new. Yeah,
He was a
new.
slate dealer in
Yeah.
Albany, and so you might not have heard his story about West Point. I just have to bore everyone with the story because it's one of my favorite slate stories. He got a huge contract to put in the new dining room floor at West Point, and they've got a big mess hall. You know, it's huge, and so that's a lot of floor covering. And so he's talking to the architect, and he's talking to the people at West Point, and he gets a slate down there from Pulteney, and I don't know what color it is, but it's all the same color. And it's installed, and then he gets a very angry phone call from one of the commandants. The different tiles do not all look the same. This is a military institution, everything needs to be exactly the same. Remove the floor now!
Oh my God.
Well,
Did that actually happen?
well, that conversation happened. Saner heads prevailed and the floor is still there. So if you ever go to West Point and eat food there, you can know that you are eating it while sitting on a locally sourced stone.
That is uniform or no?
No, you didn't have to change it, yeah. It's slate, it's
Well, it's
a natural
look
problem.
like snowflakes, right?
Yeah.
You look up very close, there are differences, right? In the patterns, the shape, the sizes. But if you stand back, look at the snowbank. Snow, right? So that's where the devil's in the details there. Like you send out a sample to an architect, also make a sample of black, of gray, of green, whatever, and then 2 months later, oh, I need some more samples. Well, they're not identical. Why don't there's a black speck on this one, and this one doesn't have it, or this one's. Yes, there's a natural stone pulled out of the ground, and there's definitely differences between every piece. So it's tough to explain to some people.
The only non-uniform thing.
Oh, I don't know. He thinks the people are non-uniform too.
No, there are no uniforms.
Well, let's continue this conversation over the great snacks that Nan brought. Thank you for reading that.
You're welcome.
And before I let you go, let me also tell you about our upcoming events. This Saturday in East Arlington at 6 o'clock is a 250th anniversary remembrance of Remember Baker. We'll have a table there, but that should be a fun time with reenactors and a one-act play that's been written for that event. And then next Thursday, we're having a fourth Thursday lunchtime lecture that's not at lunchtime, and it's across the street at the library. Carl Searles, who's been doing a history of the building of highways in southern Vermont, we've had him here. He's doing a talk on what he's discovered since he talked here over at the library, and that'll be a lot of fun. And then on the 25th, so a week from Saturday, we'll be having one of our quarry hikes, not just Lake Quarry, sorry. I've got a funny story about that too. But to the Freely Quarry, which is more or less above Emerald Lake, and we'll be meeting here at 9 o'clock for that. I used to be on the board of directors at the Slate Valley Museum, and there was all talk about, who wants to go to a museum, we got to rebrand ourselves, and I said, well, what we could do? We could have the carts going really fast into the quarries and have people ride them, and we could rebrand ourselves as the Slate Escape. It didn't fly. But anyway, Chris, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.